So our last talk of this session is Thibaut Benjamin, who's going to talk to us about CaTT context of finite computads.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And, first, I'd like to say I'm very happy to talk here, and since I'm giving the last talk, I can safely say that all the talks I've seen are really good. Right? Thank you for the organizers for this really good conference. So yeah, I'm going to explain you why CaTT contexts are finite computers. I'm not expecting you to know the terms of that sentence, and actually most of my talks will be dedicated to just explaining you just what this means. Right? Yeah, this goes forward. So this talk will be about omega categories, and so before just randomly talking about them, I'll give you a brief introduction about that, why we should care about them. And I think, like for this audience, the most compelling argument is that they really describe the structure of identity types in quantitative theory. And so if you're a bit lost with omega categories in general and you want to have an intuition, just think about identity types and you will probably have. So in more detail, you can think about omega categories are like the structure of identity types, but we've added some sort of directionality. So we're sort of replacing identity types with directed identities, and you can maybe think of that as rewriting. So maybe this is like towards theory for proof-relevant rewriting, or maybe directed homotopy with the connection between identity types and homotopy theory, and that would have application to concurrent programming. But I'm not going to go into that at all. Right, so briefly, what are those omega categories? Well, we start with something that's called a globular set. It's like a graph, but with cells in higher dimension like this. And we want a categorical structure, so we are going to add some compositions, nothing surprising there. You can compose one cell, you can compose two cells in two different ways, the same way you can do for two categories or five categories, and then three cells in three different ways. And well, you go all the way up to infinity. And I'm interested in weak omega categories. Oh, sorry. Obviously, you have axioms, like in usual category theory. And I'm interested in weak omega categories. So everything is, all the axioms are true up to the higher cell, which I will see as a cell witnessing the equivalence in the sense that it's sort of like an identity witness. Right. So how can we understand omega categories? So there are several ways that have been presented. So today we'll be interested in two different presentations. One is a dependent type theory called CaTT, which was introduced by Eric Finster and Samuel Nimram. And another one is through the means of a combinatorial device called computads, which are inductively defined by Dean, Finster, Markakis, Reuter, and Vickery. Their definition predates that, but they really gave an explicit description from which we can understand omega categories, which is really nice. And there are a bunch of things that we sort of know about those things already. First, we know that CaTT is equivalent to another notion of weak omega categories, which is through the mean of coherator, a notion introduced by Groth and Ioannis. We'll not delve in that today. We also know that this presentation in terms of computad gives rise to a monad that's equivalent to a globular monad given by Patten and Leinster. Again, we'll not delve into that today, but an interesting thing is that we know that those two coherator and globular monads are sort of equivalent, and so we sort of have an obvious missing picture, like missing thing in this picture, which is this arrow on the top here, which is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm really about comparing CaTT and the presentation in terms of computers. Right. So as I said, most of my talk will be dedicated to explaining what those things are. So CaTT is a dependent type theory, which aims at introducing weak omega categories. And if you were here for Owen's talk, he explained the gap for categories. And you can think of this as some sort of analog to that, except it's for omega categories. So we have way more type constructors, I mean, more types and more terms, but we don't have equations. because omega categories are free equation. I'll explain that a little bit later. So we have two type constructors. The first one is the star type, is like a generic object. I'm not really like it's a generic type object. I'm not picking like natural numbers, for instance, or anything. I'm just like a thing I don't know anything about a priori. And the arrow constructor, that it might be a bit confusing to denote it with an arrow because it's not like a function in deep theory, but it's more like a directed equality. But if you look at the introduction rule, this is really a directed equality. Like this is really the same as the equality introduction, right? So yeah, that's the idea. The arrow represents abstract directed equality. Like there's no, it doesn't compute the same way it does in homotopy type theory, but we can compose them in a way that represents. And the structure of this, just with these type things, we get already all the globular sets. And I can give you an example. If I write a context like this, using those types, when I can just read out the context and get a globular set. So everything of type star, I will interpret it as an object, as a point. And everything of type arrow, well, I will interpret it as an arrow between those two things. And if I had an arrow between arrows, it would be a two-dimensional arrow. And an arrow between two-dimensional arrows would be a three-dimensional arrow, and so on. All right. So now I have globular sets that's good already. I want to add all the operations that I need, but I don't really want to add an operation to compose morphisms, and then an operation to compose two cells, and then an operation to compose three cells. I mean, two different operations for two cells, three different operations for three cells, and all the things to get the associators and the uniters and all that. I don't want to add all of that by hand, so I'll use some sort of a trick to have a scheme to introduce everything at once, because I don't know any other way to do it actually. So this trick is using what we call pacing schemes or pacing diagrams, which are diagrams which are meant to represent an essentially unique way of composing. And I'll give you an algorithm for constructing these, and it will be a bit abstract at first, but don't worry. I'll run you through an example, and I think it's enough to make it clear. But the idea is that the only thing you're allowed to obtain pacing scheme is to start with a smaller pacing scheme, start with a free space or an empty space where you're allowed to add something, and just add one thing in there, but freely. You're not adding it in a way that introduces any loop, for instance. So as an example, well, like formally, I have this rule here. This is my first rule, which is the start rule. Really, it's saying that if I have just a single point, this is a pacing scheme, and the single point is a valid place where I can extend it. Right. The second rule tells me that if I have a pacing scheme and I know X is a valid place to extend it, then I can extend it in a way by adding another copy of X, which I'm calling Y here, and an F, which goes from F to Y. So that's why I'm saying I'm adding something freely, because I'm also adding the target at the same time. So there's no way I can introduce loop because the target was not here before. I'm declaring with that F is a valid place to extend it. Now, if I have a valid place to extend my pacing scheme, I can drop down to the target of the valid place, and that will also be a valid place. And well, finally, if I have a point which is a valid place, I can just say, oh, when I'm done, I don't want to do that. All right, so let me run you through an example, because that's a bit of a mouthful. So we'll start with start. So we have this judgment here, which says that, can I point somehow? I guess not. Yeah, I don't know how. Oh yeah, like that. Yeah, so we have this judgment here, which says that the point is a valid place to extend, and I'll draw the corresponding diagram here with the highlighted thing as being like the valid place where I can extend. So I have only one. Okay, I have two things I could do. I could stop here, but I don't really want to, because that would be a very boring example. So I'll extend, And here I get this thing, and that becomes this diagram here, where f is now a valid place to extend. And since I used extend here, I'll draw a thing that goes up here, and you'll understand what that is at the end of the construction, probably. So let me extend again. So here, what do I get? Well, I get a 2 cell now because I extended on 1 cell, and I get this judgment here. It's kind of cropped. Oh, it's better on the other screen. And since I extended again, I'm going up again. Okay, let's change a little bit and not extend anymore. Firstly, because I don't want to draw 3 cells, and also because I want to change things. So let's do a drop thing. So I was at A, like I was focused at A, now I'm being focused at G. And I'm drawing a thing that goes down to indicate that I did a drop rule. So let's keep going that way. I'll extend once again. So I get a B thing, like a B2 cell. I'll drop onto the H, and then I'll drop onto the Y, and then I'll just extend once again, I get K, and drop a final time to the Z, and declare that I'm done. And so you see along the way, I've sort of traced this diagram here where I go up when I extend and I go down when I drop. And the sort of diagrams I obtain this way are these like mountain valley diagram, which start and end at the same level, and it never goes below that level. And those are called dig path, and they are an interesting thing you can study, like a common storage object you might have seen. I get this sort of globular set as a result, and this derivation here of thing that says this thing is a globular set is a basic. Sorry. All right. So now the idea to define weak omega categories is to enforce this condition that every pacing scheme has a unique way of composing. So first, I want to say that every pacing scheme has a way of composing it. So I'll take a pacing scheme here. So gamma PS here just says that this is a pacing scheme. And then I'll take a U in the source of gamma. So I did not really define what the source of a pacing scheme is, but hopefully this is intuitive enough. And you can think of that as a way to compose the source of gamma. And this V here, you can think of it as a way to compose the target of gamma. And here I have the condition of using all the variables. You can think of it as like a legitimate way to compose this thing. And this substitution here from gamma to delta tells me that I have a generic situation delta in which I spotted a situation described by my pacing scheme gamma. And when it's the case, I can compose inside of delta following the data given by gamma, U, V, and substitution gamma, and I get something that goes from my chosen way of composing the source to my chosen way of composing the target, which are U and V. Okay? So that's for the existence. Really what I'm saying is whenever I find the pacing scheme realized inside of delta, I can compose it. But I have to choose a source and target for that. Okay, now onto the uniqueness. So its uniqueness in a very weak sense. It's like more like everything is related or some sort of contractibility property. So whenever I have gamma here, which is a pacing scheme, and I have U and V, which are two different ways of composing gamma, well, I can go from U to V. So any different ways of composing the same thing are related. And this again, there is this substitution here so that everything can be realized inside any arbitrary situation delta, and it doesn't have to be within a pacing scheme. It has to be a pacing scheme realized in a concrete situation. All right. So why do we care about CaTT? Well, firstly, this is a dependent type theory, so we have a type checker for that. And that's pretty good because that means we can work with dependent type, like we can work with omega category in a language that's directly good for that. So for instance, you can write such things here where you describe, like this, for instance, describes the composition. So if you read that carefully, you'll see that this is F and G are composable, and then I go from X to Z, which is like what you expect the composition to be. You can describe the unit, the identity, and you can describe a uniter in sort of a more complicated way, but it's still not very surprising. And this is good because we can do some proof automation, we can do synthesis on that and get some mileage out of it. Okay, so that's all for CAT. Now on to computads, and I will be essentially repeating the same story, but in a slightly different way, and I'll summarize like the differences at the end. All right, so the idea of computads is to get a valid notion of freeness for higher categories or for omega categories. How do we do that? Let's do that very naively. We start with a set of zero generator, and we say we want something freely generated by a zero generator. Well, that's not really enough. We also need one generator or morphisms. And we need to specify for each morphism the source and target, so that would be two maps like that. And then we want two generators to have the the generating two cells, and we need to specify source and target. And you might think, well, I can just go, I have two maps that go from x2 to x1. But actually, that's not really enough, because there's no, like the constraint that the source and target of the generator has to be a generator is too strong. There's no reason you want that. You might want the source of a generator to be a composite, for instance. So instead, you're going to this cell 1x thing here, which is all the things you can freely generate out of the things from x0 and x1. Right. So then you want to add three generators, and well, same problem. So we're going to this cell 2 here, and well, I think you understand where this is going, but we'll just keep going up to infinity. And just to make it more uniform, I guess, I'll just redraw the bottom with the same shape. And here on the data that I have on the left is the computad. This collection of all the x's with the diagonal maps. All right. So now I want to describe computers, and really the trick here is to reuse the same sort of pacing scheme. This is like the paper presenting computers is using a different encoding. So I'll run you through this encoding, and we'll see how it's the same. So when you have a dig path like this, one thing that you may know is that it corresponds to a tree, and those are called Batanin trees in category theory literature, but they're just like rigid planar trees. And the way you get that is by looking at the mountains here. And so you have two mountains of height 2 and one of the height 1, which are like the leaves here. And then they are connected in dimension 1, which is this connection here. And those are connected in dimension 0, which is this dimension. And the way you retrieve sort of the globular set out of that is by playing around with a token. So I'll start with my token here at the next to my source here, and I'll draw this. This is of dimension 0, so I'll draw a point for that. And then I'll move that token around. So I'll move it up in here, and this is of dimension 1, so I get an arrow here. And at this point, this is not even a valid globular set, because this doesn't have a target. But when I'm done, this will be a valid globular set. Don't worry about it too much. So then I'll move up again, and I get this 2 cell here. And now that I'm all the way up, I'll go back down in this position here to get that. And I'll keep going this way, sort of in an infix order around the tree. And by doing that, I just went through all the points of the dig path here in order. So this is sort of the correspondence between dig path, Batanin trees, globular sets like that, and if you remember the derivation that I showed you for pixels. Okay, good. So I'm going to call that positions of B, this globular set. Well, really a pacing scheme that I obtained out of the tree B. Okay, so now I want to describe those things explicitly. And in order to do that, well, I'll say that these are given by either elements of the form var x, where x is a generator. So I want generators to be cells in particular. And or I want to have them of this form here, where I have coherence B, U, V, and gamma, where B now is a pattern entry instead of a basic scheme, but we've seen it's kind of the same. U and V are terms of lower dimension, and we also require they satisfy some conditions which are very similar to the ones satisfied by CaTT. And this gamma here is a way to understand my positions of B inside of a global set X. And in that case, I can realize the composition. All right. So very briefly, because I'm running out of time a little bit, you can build a category of computads where the morphisms are really a bit unusual. They take generators to cells and not generators to generators. So if you read the literature on computads, most people want morphisms to have generator to generator. Yeah. And but this is analogous to substitutions, right? You take a variable to a term and a variable to a variable substitution. So you should think of it like that. And you can take the opposite category of computads and give it a CWF structure. And just showing that briefly, computads are really interesting. In general, they give you a notion of cofibrant object and cofibrant replacement. So that's interesting if you're into that sort of things. Right, so now onto our results. So just as a recap, so in CaTT we have finite context, but in computads nothing tells us that we need to have finite stuff. In CaTT everything is ordered because we are adding variables one by one, but in computads we're adding them bunch by bunch and not ordered. Here it's done by structural induction, and here it's done by induction of the dimension. Here we're using pasting schemes, and here pattern entries, and in CaTT we have named variables, and in computads there's unnamed variables. And basically these are all the differences that if you compare the two things and squint enough, you'll only see that those differences. Actually, the named thing is not really relevant because we can use double levels in CaTT and we get rid of the name. This is just an artifact of how I presented it. Okay. The pasting scheme and pattern entries, I've already shown you how they are equivalent. I think I've spent enough time on that, so hopefully you get the gist of it. So really, what we have is finite ordered and structural induction versus infinite unordered and induction dimension. And what we've shown is that, well, there's not really a way around finite and infinite, but the two other things are not really a problem. This is more of a logical problem, the difference of the structure of the induction. But this is fine, and ordered and unordered is not that much of a problem because in CaTT you can change the order and have isomorphisms between like you have substitutions that change the order of variables that are isomorphisms. So we could prove that there exists a fully faithful morphisms from syntactic category of CaTT to the opposite category of computads. And it's a morphism CWF, but what we care about really is that it's a fully faithful functor, and the essential image is made of finite computers, so those with finite image. And that's it. CaTT context of finite computers. So just before finishing, I guess, a word of conclusion. So this I presented a very explicit connection, syntactic connection, let's say, between the category CaTT and the language that we get out of the description of computads. But we can also leverage that to get a more direct connection between the semantics of those things. This is really using a bunch of results that are known results about like monads with arities and that kind of stuff. So it gets really complicated, but we really can. What I mean is the syntactic translation also has implication on models and semantics. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks for the talk, Thibaut. when you have that picture, when you were talking about it was like X0, X1, blah, blah, and
Yeah.
cell, stuff like that. So it's very reminiscent of various different shape categories. Like consider like the glow category or the simplex category, but you don't have morphisms going the opposite way. For instance, if you compare the glow category to the reflexive glow category, you would have a morphism that goes from X0 to X1, which says that every object has an identity arrow associated to it. So why is there nothing like that in this picture? Why is it not necessary? This is supposed to be like the generators for an omega test.
Yeah, so if you look at, okay, so specifically if you look at reflexive globes, what you have is you have the identity that's sort of encoded in the shape that you're considering. Here I have just simple globular sets, and instead the identities are encoded in the monad that is put on top of them. So here the cell here will contain an identity, a thing that witnesses the identity.
And a second question as well. I think a couple of slides after this, you show that when you define the category of computads. So the morphisms that you have in that category, are they like Kleisli? Is it some Kleisli category and cell and is maybe some sort of graded monad or something?
It's not. So it's not a graded monad, but it's a Kleisli category. Yes, it's not a Kleisli category. Is it?
It looks like the classic category for the 3 omega category monad, but it has more objects. It sits somewhere between the classic category and the other.
Yeah,
Could it potentially be graded one? There's more objects.
Okay, so it's apparently it's not a Kleisli category, but these are Kleisli morphisms of some sort, right? Like they look like Kleisli morphisms.
To me, they look like it, yes.
Well,
The big difference. So
Why the globular set is going to be a classic one?
Yeah,
Why
yeah,
might be?
that's
I should say on those morphisms, these are the natural morphisms to consider, because if you look at the things as being cofibrant things, the things that you were talking about earlier, where you send generators to generators, those are going to also be free morphisms on the underlying morphisms of computads. However, these are actual morphisms between the three infinity categories on those computads.
Yeah,
These are the natural.
yeah, indeed. Those are the morphisms that you get if you believe computads are things are like a subcategory of the category, right? Of categories. Indeed.
Well, I think we're all very tired. It's Friday night, so
Yeah,
thank you
that's
very
fine.
much.